Hello, YouTube, and welcome to today's discussion on whether homeopathy can really cure COVID-19. You might be wondering, why are we even asking this wild question? Well, recently there was a paper published in the Journal of Public Health from Theory to Practice, and the paper is entitled Homeopathy Can Combat Against Coronavirus Disease. This paper was published by 3 Greek scientists in the School of Materials Engineering, a Polytechnic Institute, and the School of Dentistry. Before we even get to evaluating the paper's contents, we have to briefly discuss the history of homeopathy and its original founder, Samuel Hahnemann. So what is the historical context in which homeopathy is starting to be developed? Well, according to one history paper, campaigns against the quack charlatans, mountebanks, cranks, and hucksters of medicine in Britain go back at least as far as the 16th century, when the kingdom's first Parliament Act regulating the practice of medicine was passed in 1512. Not least as a response to the great multitude of common artificers, smiths, weavers, and women that boldly and accustomedly took upon them great cures. To the high displeasure of God, great infamy of the faculty and the grievous hurt, damage and destruction even of the many of the king's liege people. So the basic idea in plain English is that there are many fraudsters out there trying to produce all kinds of remedies to cure all kinds of diseases, and that there needed to be legislation passed to regulate the practice of medicine, which was done so in 1512. According to another history paper, A Brief History of Homeopathy, most of the pre-1850 quacks tended to specialize. Some were bone setters, others claimed to cure venereal disease without the use of mercury. A Dr. Taylor of Beverly and Gloucester even arranged to attend regularly at the 3 public houses to which patients only had to send their urine, and he would tell at once whether they were curable or not. There were self-styled occultists who specialized in the treatment of cataract and even cures of cancer without doing any surgical operations whatsoever. Most of these irregulars were not only uneducated, but even illiterate in some cases, and only a minority were full-time healers. They usually had regular jobs, such as being a blacksmith, a grocer, or a butcher, and they often claimed the patronage of the great and the good. So this led to the rise of complementary and alternative medicine as we describe it today. So who was Samuel Hahnemann? Well, Samuel Hahnemann grew up in Germany, having received his medical degree in 1779. He was fortunate to die a millionaire in Paris in 1843. Even so, during his first 15 years as a physician, which is quite a long time, 15 years, he struggled desperately to make a living of any kind. So how did he get interested in homeopathy? Well, he started to take regular doses of what we now call quinine, which produced all the symptoms of intermittent fever, which we now call malaria, but only to a mild degree. So what's the idea? The idea is that if a patient had an illness, it could be cured by giving a medicine which, if given to a healthy person, would produce similar symptoms of that same illness, but to a slighter degree. Thus, if a patient was suffering from severe nausea, he was given a medicine which in a healthy person would even provoke nausea, but only to a mild degree. More generally, the claim of homeopathy is that the intensity of a homeopathic remedy is inversely proportional to the density of the substance in the remedy. Okay, so what does this technical language mean in simpler terms? Well, let's use an example. Consider extremely dilute bits of iron phosphate, which is a compound, in a large quantity of water in order to treat anemia. So anemia is when you're iron deficient. So the idea is that the lower the density of the substance, which I'm going to represent using this little arrow here, the lower the density of the substance, the more intense the homeopathic remedy is supposed to be in terms of its effects. That's what it means to say that there's an inversely proportional relationship. Okay, that's why we're talking about extremely dilute bits in water of iron phosphate. So here's a quick picture of modern homeopathic remedies. So these are little bottles inside containing pills, and these pills contain a little substance that's been highly diluted in water. So you might wonder, how many people are actually using homeopathy these days? Well, according to a 2016 paper published in the American Journal of Public Health, among US adults, 2.1% used homeopathy within the past 12 months. Homeopathic remedies are being used to treat all kinds of conditions, such as asthma, depression, allergic rhinitis, headaches, migraines, even neurotic disorders, dermatitis, arthritis, and hypertension, with asthma being the most reported. So this is interesting because homeopathies claim to be effective for treating respiratory issues such as asthma, as well as allergies, and even mental health disorders such as depression and neurotic disorders. Okay, so let's get right into this paper. Before we get into the paper, though, we have to analyze the abstract of the paper. So the aims of the paper are to note that this is the third serious coronavirus outbreak in less than 20 years, the first two being SARS, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome, and Middle East respiratory syndrome in 2012. The aim of the study is to show that the global collective effort to control the COVID-19 pandemic should also consider alternative therapeutic methods, and that national health systems should quickly endorse the validity of proven homeopathic treatments. It's quite a bold claim that they're claiming that homeopathic treatments have empirical evidence supporting them. So what does the subject and method section say? Well, they say that with the help of mathematics alone, they will show that the fundamental therapeutic law in which homeopathy is founded can be proven. Notice that they don't mention any experimental evidence whatsoever. That is, they claim purely with the usage of mathematics alone that it is sufficient to show that homeopathy is effective. More strongly, they claim that the mathematical proof, quote unquote, justifies perfectly the usage of homeopathy. So let's see whether or not their claims stand up to scrutiny. In the introduction of their paper, they describe how coronavirus originated in Wuhan, China. They also describe some symptoms of COVID-19 as a respiratory illness. Some of these symptoms include that of fever, fatigue, headache, cardiac injuries, and diarrhea, among other more serious symptoms. They describe previous remedies to try to treat COVID-19, such as anti-inflammatory drugs. All of the drug options come from experience in treating SARS, MERS, and other kind of coronavirus diseases. These drugs above may prove helpful, but their efficacy needs to be further confirmed. So it's good that this paper actually mentions that further research needs to be done into the efficacy of anti-inflammatory drugs, amongst other kinds of medical interventions. So let's get right into the results and discussion section. They claim that homeopathy is a natural therapy method and an experimental science. This is ironic considering that they claim to use pure mathematics alone to show that homeopathy is effective without doing any experiments whatsoever. So in a sense, this paper contradicts itself. Homeopathy as a healing method is based upon the Hippocratic idea, Hippocrates is an ancient Greek physician, of like cures like. That's just a quick translation of this Latin phrase. The physician is supposed to rely on the wholeness of symptoms revealed during the entire evolution of the infection and prescribes an ultra-high diluted Succus solution, which has been proven to heal similar conditions. Notice they provide no citation for how this is supposed to be proven. So there's no reason to think that this is true. Furthermore, they claim that homeopathic interventions can be immediate and very helpful for the patient. So this is quite profound if it's true. After all, COVID-19 is a deadly disease. And if we can find a way to cure it without having to rely upon a vaccine, and then we can just use something as simple as homeopathic treatments, then that would be something worthy potentially of the Nobel Prize in Medicine, if we could even show this. But as I will argue, there's no way that they could show this. So let's get right into the mathematics of what they claim. So let E be a variable representing the patient, and let E apostrophe be the prover. And a prover is supposed to be a healthy person on whom a homeopathic remedy is tested for effectiveness. A is defined as a so-called dynamic operator, dynamic meaning occurring over the course of time, operator, which will be defined in just a moment, of the pathogenic disease. X sub I is equal to symptom or symptoms of the physical disease, which correspond to the alterations of the biochemical kinetics of the organism after the action of A. So like I said, A is equal to the dynamic operator of the pathogenic cause. X sub I is the symptoms after the action of A. X sub 0 here is defined as the normal biochemical kinetics of the organism. Okay, so this is represented in this equation right here. So all this is saying is that if you have a normally healthy person and you apply a disease to them, then they have a set of diseased symptoms. So what does operator mean here? Well, according to their definition, which is listed right here, operator means a symbol which, when being applied to a function, is transformed into another. That is, I guess, another function. But this doesn't make any sense whatsoever if you actually think about what they're claiming. After all, if it is true that A is supposed to be an operator that acts on a function, that presupposes then that X sub 0 is a function, but it's not a function. Rather, X sub 0 is the normal biochemical kinetics of the organism. That is, a function, after all, is supposed to be a mapping between two sets, A and B. But X sub 0 is not a mapping between two sets. Rather, it's just a state of the organism at the time, which is not represented by function. C is supposed to be a dynamic operator representing the cure of the disease. X sub prime as X sub I prime is supposed to be the symptoms after having the action of the cure. So let's see how this all works in their model. Well, you have the diseased symptoms, you apply the cure, and then you're supposed to get healthier symptoms. That's the basic idea. So what's going on over here when they mention B? Well, they're introducing another operator B that intermediates between cure and disease. But the conditions on the operator B are very specific. That is, they claim that B inverse exists, but we have no guarantee whatsoever for those who've studied a bit of matrix algebra that B, if it were to be represented as a matrix, which is plausible given the notation that they're trying to use here, that it even has an inverse. We have no idea. In fact, in order for a matrix to exist, to have an inverse, it has to have a non-zero determinant. For those who've studied a bit of matrix algebra, you'd know this. And nowhere have they shown that B is in any way a matrix or that it has an inverse or it has a non-zero determinant. In fact, they don't even describe the operationally defined, empirically relevant terms of the theory. That is, we have no way to know how we even measure B in real life situations. We further have no way to verify this experimentally, whether or not the cure is actually equal to BA B inverse, as listed right here. Lastly, they claim that this shows that C and A are related by an affine transformation. And this just comes out of nowhere. Nowhere have they actually proven that this is related by a so-called affine transformation, which is a very specific set of conditions. Furthermore, they claim that homeopathy is an individualized system of therapy. Therefore, there is no possibility that one remedy will cure all cases of a specific pathology. That is, it's a case-by-case basis. And if it's a case-by-case basis, it follows that no general mathematical law of this particular kind, that is an ill-defined operator-based equation that has no empirically verifiable or testable terms of the theory, there's no way that such a general law then can apply if it is true that one remedy cannot cure all cases of a specific pathology when it comes to homeopathy. So they explicitly acknowledge that homeopathy is context-based, and yet they use a general law. That is not even falsifiable. That is, we cannot even test whether or not the law actually applies in reality. This being said, they can claim in their conclusion that it is imperative that ever safe medicinal products are tested in this pandemic. Okay, so they explicitly mention that they haven't done any tests. They're just asking for us to conduct such tests. The second controversial claim is that they claim that they're ever safe. The homeopathic remedies are very, very safe. I hope to show in what follows that both of these claims are completely false. That is, that homeopathic remedies are generally not safe, and that they have already been tested and shown to be ineffective. In fact, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States of America claims that there are no FDA-approved products labeled as homeopathic. The FDA further claims that these products have been found to contain measurable amounts of active ingredients and therefore could cause significant patient harm. Here's a list of case studies which you can look at on the FDA website up here. Products labeled as homeopathic and currently marketed in the US have not been reviewed by the FDA for safety and effectiveness to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent, or mitigate any diseases or conditions whatsoever. I'm underlining several times any here. FDA recommends consumers talk to their doctor or healthcare professional about safe and effective treatments for their disease or condition as opposed to seeking homeopathic remedies. And they reiterate one more time that there are currently no homeopathic products approved by the FDA. Furthermore, the FDA has issued warning letters to companies who produce homeopathic drug products for significant violations of current good manufacturing practice, including severe side effects such as eye infections, among other things. As you'll see, there are far worse effects of homeopathy beyond just eye infections. But before we get to the effects, we have to look at the experimental evidence for homeopathic treatment's effectiveness. So I've set up a little table here, and I've labeled the top one with a star and these other ones with X's. And the reason for this is because X's represent evidence against homeopathy, and the star represents some mild evidence in favor of homeopathy's effectiveness. So if we look at the top row here, we see that there are 107 trials conducted, 81 trials reported positive results. So that seems like, some evidence, right? I mean, after all, we did 107 tests, 81 of those seem to be positive. So doesn't that support homeopathy? Well, no, it doesn't, because it says most trials were of low quality. That is, there was various aspects of the research design that were considered flawed relative to contemporary scientific standards. Furthermore, the conclusion drawn is that there's not sufficient enough evidence to draw definitive conclusions as to the efficacy of homeopathy, even though there were 81 trials that reported positive results. So it's not just that a trial reports a positive result, you have to make sure that the trial is of high quality. 89 randomized controlled trials were surveyed by Lind et al., and they claimed that no firm evidence for any single condition whatsoever. Another study claims that evidence is not convincing because of shortcomings and inconsistencies in 32 randomized controlled trials. Another study claims that all trials were burdened with serious methodological flaws and that there's no evidence of effects greater than placebos. So for those who don't know, a placebo is a substance that is usually given that is completely inert. That is, it's like a sugar pill or just some kind of tasteless pill that is given to a control group versus an experimental group, where an experimental group is treated with the drug that is being tested, so in this case, a homeopathic remedy, and we compare whether or not the effect size from the experimental group is going to be greater than that of the size for the placebo group, that is the fake drug that is given to the control group. So according to 3 RCTs, there's no evidence of effects greater than placebos. Another study claims that studies of high quality are more likely to be negative. That is, amongst these 17 randomized control trials, there was some evidence suggesting that homeopathy is more effective than a placebo, but the higher quality the study was, the more likely it was to deliver a negative result. That is, that homeopathy is not effective. Lastly, another study conducted over 41 randomized control trials claims that the effects of homeopathy are not significantly different from those of a placebo. So as you can see, there's lots of experimental evidence against the efficacy of homeopathy. To make matters worse, according to a 2013 paper entitled Annual Report of the American Association of Poison Control, published in an excellent journal called Clinical Toxicology, there was even a single death recorded when someone took homeopathy, compared to a wide variety of other kinds of substances, such as energy drinks, caffeine, melatonin pills, which are a form of sleep aid. And if you look here at this section, you can see that the number of minor, moderate, and major negative outcomes, after all, this is a poison control study, is significantly higher than that of other kinds of substances. So you might look here and you say, well, what about melatonin? They had 985, 11 for the minor negative outcomes section. That's not for the moderate or for the major section. For the moderate and major section, as you can see right here, far higher for the cases of homeopathic agents. According to a testimony of the Center for Inquiry by Michael Dodora on behalf of the Food and Drug Administration, this study claimed that they reviewed an Australian National Health and Medical Research Council report, which was a meta-study assessing more than 1,800 papers. According to their testimony, that there are no health conditions for which there is reliable evidence that homeopathy is effective. No health conditions whatsoever. Reviewing more than 1,800 papers. To make matters worse, unfortunately, people have died because they took homeopathy instead of mainstream medical interventions. For example, Lucille Craven of New Hampshire was diagnosed in 1997 with breast cancer. Although her doctor recommended mastectomy, which is a mainstream medical practice, Lucille treated her cancer with homeopathy instead, and she died less than 36 months later. Very tragic, very sad. Diane Peach of Wisconsin was diagnosed in late 1998 with lung cancer. After successful surgery to remove her tumor, her cancer grew back. She visited a homeopathic clinic where she was advised to halt further medical treatments. That is, advised to halt mainstream medical treatments. As a consequence, she died in April 2000. So even in cases in which homeopathy itself is not dangerous, it is nonetheless dangerous because it persuades people to take homeopathy instead of recognized medical interventions that can help with illnesses. So to conclude, I leave you with some philosophical considerations to reflect upon. Just because a theory is intuitively appealing in some sense, or just because it's widely believed, doesn't mean that it is true or that it holds up to scientific scrutiny. Just because a study uses mathematics also does not mean it is a good study, as I've shown earlier. This being said, if we don't have any evidence for or against a theory, we should try our best to remain as neutral as possible. After all, we should have an open mind. But the thing that's different about homeopathy is that there is considerable empirical evidence suggesting, as I showed you earlier, that homeopathy is either ineffective, neutral, or harmful. That is, it even led to a single death. Lastly, the mechanisms posited by homeopathy, namely the inversely proportional relationship between the efficacy of the homeopathic remedy and the density of the substance, this claim is straightforwardly inconsistent with contemporary science. There is no evidence whatsoever that such a mechanism exists according to physics, chemistry, and biology. In fact, rather humorously, if you think about it right now, even in the ambient air of your room, there is a very low density of all kinds of substances. That is low density relative to the ambient air. It would follow that according to Hahnemann's inverse law, that we would all be overdosing on homeopathy right now. Obviously, we're not overdosing on homeopathy. Therefore, we reject the assumption that homeopathy's law makes any sense. And so that's it for today's discussion. For those who want further reading, you're welcome to check out the following sources.